Her husband sold her for debt until a cowboy changed everything with a $500 bid. The auction block stood in the center of town square, weathered wood stained dark from years of use. Mary Sullivan's hands trembled as her husband Frank shoved her forward, his grip bruising her arm. The crowd gathered thick, men with hungry eyes and women whispering behind gloved hands. Frank owed $500 to the wrong people, and now she was the payment. The auctioneer, a fat man named Pete Morrison, grabbed her wrist and pulled her up onto the platform. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. She searched the crowd for a friendly face, but found only strangers. Her cotton dress, the blue one she'd sewn herself last spring, suddenly felt too thin against the afternoon wind. "Starting bid, gentlemen, is $100, Morrison called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of voices. Mary's stomach twisted. Frank stood at the edge of the platform, counting money in his head, already spending what he'd get for selling his wife like livestock. 3 years of marriage, and this was how it ended. She remembered the day they wed, how he'd promised to protect her, to love her. Those promises turned to ash the moment gambling debts piled higher than his conscience. "100," someone shouted from the back. "150," another voice called. Mary closed her eyes. This couldn't be happening. But the calluses on her hands and the ache in her bones told her it was real. Every bit of it. "200," a man near the front bid, leering at her with tobacco-stained teeth. The bidding climbed. "250. 350. Each number felt like a nail in a coffin. Mary wanted to run, to disappear into the desert and never look back. But Morrison's meaty hand held her in place. Frank watched with dead eyes, caring only that the price kept rising. Then a voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady. $500. The crowd went silent. Mary opened her eyes and saw him. A cowboy stood at the back, hat pulled low over his face, dust coating his worn leather jacket. He wasn't like the others. Something in his posture suggested he wasn't here for the same reasons as the rest of them. "500 going once," Morrison said, surprise evident in his tone. Nobody countered. 500 was more than most men made in half a year. The crowd shifted, uncertain, as the cowboy walked forward. He was tall, lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that seemed to see straight through the world's ugliness. When he reached the platform, he pulled out a thick roll of bills and counted them onto Morrison's outstretched palm. "Sold," Morrison announced, shoving Mary toward her new owner. She stumbled down the steps, and the cowboy caught her elbow to steady her. His touch was firm but not rough. Up close, she could see a scar running along his jaw and threads of gray in his dark hair. He couldn't have been more than 35. "Come on," he said quietly, his voice like gravel and honey mixed together. Mary glanced back at Frank one last time. He pocketed the money Morrison handed him and walked away without looking at her. Not even a goodbye. Just gone, like their marriage had meant nothing at all. The cowboy led her to a horse tied outside the general store, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes. He helped Mary mount, then swung up behind her. The crowd watched them ride out of town, speculation running wild about who the stranger was and what he planned to do with his expensive purchase. Mary sat rigid in the saddle, her mind racing. She didn't know this man. Didn't know if he was better or worse than the others who'd bid on her. All she knew was that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't predict, and the only thing she could do was survive whatever came next. The cowboy didn't speak as they rode. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by hills and brush. The sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Mary's fear began to mix with curiosity. Where was he taking her? What did he want? After an hour of riding, he finally broke the silence. "Name's Jake Harrison," he said, "and I'm not what you think I am." Mary didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that men's words rarely matched their actions. "You're wondering why I paid $500 for you," Jake continued. "Fair question. I'll answer it when we get where we're going. For now, just know this. You're not property." "Not to me." Those words hung in the air between them as they rode deeper into the wilderness, toward an uncertain future that somehow felt less terrifying than the past she was leaving behind. The ranch appeared as darkness crept across the land. It wasn't much, just a small cabin with a barn and corral, tucked into a valley between two ridges. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone else was there. Jake dismounted and helped Mary down, her legs unsteady after the long ride. An older woman emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She had kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun. "This her?" the woman asked. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied. "Mary Sullivan, meet Helen Carter. She runs this place with me." Helen approached Mary with a warm smile. "Come inside, dear. You must be exhausted and hungry. We'll get you settled." Mary followed Helen into the cabin, confused but cautiously hopeful. The interior was clean and simple, with a stone fireplace, wooden table, and 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. The smell of stew filled the air, making her stomach growl. She hadn't eaten since morning. "Sit," Helen commanded gently, ladling stew into a bowl. "Jake, you too. And you better start explaining before this poor girl thinks we're crazy." Jake removed his hat and sat across from Mary. His face looked tired in the lamplight, etched with the kind of weariness that came from carrying heavy burdens. "I know what happened today seems strange," he began. "Truth is, I've been watching your husband for weeks. Heard he was planning to sell you. I couldn't let you end up with the men who were circling that auction." Mary Spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "You bought me to save me?" "I bought you because nobody should be sold like cattle," Jake said firmly. "My sister was sold the same way 5 years ago. Her husband had debts, same as yours. She ended up with a man who worked her to death within 2 years. I couldn't save her, but I could save you." The words hit Mary like a physical blow. She saw the pain in Jake's eyes, the guilt he carried. "I'm sorry about your sister." Jake nodded, looking down at his hands. They were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who knew hard work. Her name was Emma. She was strong and smart and deserved better than what she got. When I heard about your situation, I knew I had to do something." Helen placed a gentle hand on Mary's shoulder. "You're safe here, dear. We're not asking anything from you except that you help around the ranch if you're willing. You'll have your own room, your own space, and when you're ready, if you want to leave and start fresh somewhere else, we'll help you do that too." Mary's eyes filled with tears. She'd prepared herself for the worst, for brutality, for being used and discarded. Instead, she'd found unexpected kindness from strangers who owed her nothing. "Why would you do this for me?" "You don't even know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," Jake said simply, "and because everyone deserves a chance to be free." The stew tasted better than anything Mary had eaten in months. As she ate, Helen chattered about the ranch, about the chickens and the vegetable garden and the 2 horses they owned. Jake sat quietly, occasionally adding details, but mostly just watching Mary with those perceptive eyes of his. After dinner, Helen showed Mary to a small bedroom at the back of the cabin. It had a real bed with clean sheets, a washstand with a mirror, and a window overlooking the valley. "This is yours," Helen said. "Lock the door if it makes you feel safer. Nobody will bother you here." Mary stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," Helen replied with a smile. "Just rest. Tomorrow's a new day, and you can start figuring out what comes next." Alone in the room, Mary sat on the bed and let the tears come. They weren't tears of sadness, though there's plenty of that too. They were tears of relief, of disbelief, of hope she'd thought was dead and buried. For the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, her life could be something other than pain and disappointment. She thought about Frank and felt nothing but emptiness where love used to live. He'd shown his true nature today, and there was no coming back from that. She thought about Jake and Helen, these strangers who'd offered her sanctuary without asking for anything in return, and she thought about the future, uncertain and frightening, but no longer completely bleak. Outside, she could hear Jake and Helen talking in low voices, but couldn't make out the words. The night sounds of the ranch filtered through the window, crickets and distant coyotes, and the soft nickering of horses. Mary lay back on the bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was the first peaceful sleep she'd had in longer than she could remember. And for the first time in years, she dreamed of something other than escape. She dreamed of possibility. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the window. Mary woke confused for a moment, forgetting where she was. Then memory returned, and with it, a strange mixture of emotions. She was free from Frank, but what did that freedom actually mean? She was still legally his wife, still bound by laws that gave him rights over her. Helen was already up, working in the kitchen when Mary emerged. "Morning, dear. There's coffee on the stove and biscuits in the oven. Help yourself." "Thank you," Mary said quietly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Where's Jake?" "Out checking the fence line. He'll be back around noon." Helen studied Mary with a critical but kind eye. "You sleep all right?" "Better than I have in a long time." "Good. I thought today you might like to see the ranch properly, get your bearings. Later, if you're up for it, I could use help in the garden. But no pressure. You take whatever time you need." Mary nodded, grateful for Helen's understanding. She sipped her coffee and watched the older woman work, efficient and content. There was a peace to Helen that Mary envied, a sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "Can I ask you something?" Mary ventured after a while. "Of course. How do you know Jake? Are you family?" Helen smiled, a touch of sadness in it. "No blood relation. Jake saved my life too, in a manner of speaking. My husband died 10 years ago, left me with nothing but debts. I was about to lose everything when Jake showed up. He just inherited some money from a relative, and he bought this land, built this ranch. He asked if I wanted to help run it, give me a fresh start. Been here ever since. He makes a habit of saving people, doesn't he?" "He does. Jake's seen the worst of what people can do to each other, and he's decided to push back against it in his own way. Not many men like him left in this world." Mary absorbed this information, her curiosity about Jake growing. He was an unusual man, no question about that. Most cowboys she'd known were either rough and crude or slick and charming, hiding darkness behind polite words. Jake seemed different, genuine in a way that made her want to trust him despite her better judgment. The morning passed quietly. Mary helped Helen with household chores, finding comfort in the simple routine of ordinary work. It felt good to be busy, to have purpose beyond survival. Helen was easy company, neither too talkative nor too silent, and she had a dry sense of humor that made Mary laugh despite everything. Jake returned at noon, as predicted, riding in with the sun high overhead. He dismounted and led his horse to the barn, moving with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Mary watched from the window, noting the way he treated the horse with gentle respect, talking to it softly as he removed the saddle. Lunch was a simple affair, bread and cheese and leftover stew. Jake ate quickly, his mind clearly occupied with ranch business. "I'll be heading into town this afternoon," he announced. "Need supplies and have some business to attend to. Mary, if you're comfortable, I'd like you to come with me." "Back to that town?" "No, different town. About 3 hours west." I need to speak with a lawyer there about your situation." "My situation?" Jake met her eyes directly. "You're still legally married to Frank Sullivan. That means he could come here claiming you're his property, demanding you back. I want to see what options exist to change that." The thought of Frank coming for her sent ice through Mary's veins. "Can anything be done?" "Maybe. Depends on what grounds we have. Abandonment, cruelty, the fact that he sold you. A good lawyer might be able to build a case. But I want to explore the possibilities before we decide on a course of action." Mary nodded slowly. The idea of fighting Frank legally seemed impossible, but then again, everything that had happened in the past day seemed impossible. "All right, I'll come." They left an hour later, Jake on his bay mare and Mary on a gentle chestnut gelding Helen insisted she borrow. The ride was long and hot, the sun beating down mercilessly as they crossed open prairie. Jake kept the pace steady but not punishing, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local history. "You ever been to Clearwater?" he asked as they rode. "No. I've barely been anywhere. Frank kept me close to home." "Clearwater's a good town. Fair people, for the most part. The lawyer we're seeing, name's Patrick O'Brien. He's solid. Helped Helen sort out her legal troubles when her husband died. If anyone can help you, it's him." They arrived in Clearwater as afternoon shifted toward evening. The town was larger than the one where Mary had been sold, with proper streets and buildings that looked permanent rather than thrown together. Jake led them to a neat office on the main street, a sign above the door reading O'Brien Legal Services. Patrick O'Brien was a middle-aged man with red hair going white at the temples and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He welcomed them into his office and listened intently as Jake explained the situation. Mary sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, feeling exposed and vulnerable as the details of her humiliation were laid bare. When Jake finished, O'Brien leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This is a complicated situation, Mrs. Sullivan. The law is not on your side in most respects. A husband has considerable rights over his wife, and what he did, while morally reprehensible, isn't technically illegal in all jurisdictions." Mary's heart sank. She'd known it was too much to hope for. "However," O'Brien continued, raising a finger, "there are some angles we can pursue. First, the public nature of the sale could be considered abandonment and extreme cruelty. Second, if we can prove your husband intended to permanently relinquish his marital rights, we might argue for an annulment or divorce on those grounds. Third, there's the matter of Mr. Harrison's purchase. In the eyes of some courts, that transaction could be viewed as a contract that supersedes the marriage bond." "Would any of that actually work?" Jake asked. "Some would laugh us out of court. Others might be sympathetic, especially if we present the right evidence and arguments. It would be a fight, no question, but it's not hopeless." Mary found her voice. "What would I need to do?" First, we'd need a detailed statement from you about your marriage, the abuse or neglect you suffered, and the circumstances of the sale. Then we'd file a petition with the territorial court. Your husband would be notified and have a chance to respond. If he contests it, which he likely will if only out of spite, we'd go to trial. The whole process could take months, maybe a year. A year. A year of uncertainty, of looking over her shoulder, of wondering if Frank would show up and drag her back. But what was the alternative? Living in fear forever? I'll do it, Mary said firmly.
Whatever it takes. O'Brien nodded approvingly.
Good. We'll start the paperwork tomorrow. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay out of your husband's reach. Mr. Harrison, I trust you'll keep her safe? Count on it, Jake replied. They left the office as dusk settled over Clearwater. Jake suggested they stay at the local hotel rather than ride back in darkness, and Mary agreed, too exhausted to face another long journey. The hotel was modest but clean, and Jake got them separate rooms on different floors, maintaining propriety. Mary lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, her mind racing. She'd set something in motion today, something that couldn't be undone. Frank would know soon enough that she wasn't planning to disappear quietly. He'd be angry, maybe angry enough to come after her himself. The thought terrified her, but underneath the fear was something else. Determination. She'd spent too many years being afraid, being small, letting herself be crushed under Frank's cruelty. No more. If she was going to build a new life, she had to fight for it. And with Jake and Helen and Patrick O'Brien on her side, maybe she actually had a chance. The next morning they returned to O'Brien's office, and Mary spent 3 hours recounting every detail of her marriage that might be relevant to the case. It was painful, dredging up memories she'd tried to bury, but she forced herself through it. O'Brien took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his face growing grimmer as the story unfolded. "This is more than enough," he said when she finished. "I'll have the petition ready within a week. We'll need you to sign it, and then we file with the court. After that, it's in the hands of the legal system." "Thank you," Mary said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride out. Mary felt wrung out, emotionally exhausted from reliving her past. Jake seemed to sense this and didn't push for conversation. They rode in companionable silence, the landscape rolling past in shades of gold and brown. As they approached the ranch, Mary saw smoke rising from the chimney and felt an unexpected surge of something like homecoming. It had only been 2 days, but already this place felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived with Frank. Helen met them at the door with a worried expression. "There was a man here looking for you earlier." Didn't give his name, but he was asking questions about a woman matching Mary's description. Jake's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "That I didn't know what he was talking about and suggested he move along." He left, but he didn't look convinced. "Jake, I think it might have been someone working for her husband." Mary's blood ran cold. It was starting already. Frank wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Jake's hand moved to the gun at his hip, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. "We need to be careful." "Helen, keep the rifle loaded and nearby. Mary, don't go anywhere alone, not even to the barn. And both of you, if anyone comes around when I'm not here, you get inside, bar the door, and shoot if you have to." "You think it'll come to that?" Helen asked. "I think Frank Sullivan is the kind of man who doesn't like losing, and I think he'll see Mary leaving as a personal insult that needs correcting. So yes, I think we need to be ready for trouble." That night, Jake slept in the barn with his rifle, keeping watch. Mary lay awake in her room, listening to every sound, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. She'd thought freedom would feel different than this, lighter somehow. Instead, it felt like standing on a cliff edge, knowing a fall was coming but not knowing when. Days passed in tense watchfulness. Jake hired 2 ranch hands, brothers named Luke and Sam Peterson, who he trusted to help guard the property. They took shifts watching the approaches to the ranch, and Jake began teaching Mary how to shoot. She'd never held a gun before, and the weight of it in her hands felt strange and frightening. "Don't think of it as something scary," Jake instructed, positioning her stance. "Think of it as a tool, same as a hammer or a plow. It has a purpose, and when used right, it does that purpose well. Your purpose right now is protecting yourself." Mary squeezed off a shot, the recoil jarring her shoulder. The tin can she'd aimed at remained stubbornly upright on the fence post. She tried again and again, slowly improving, until finally one of her shots connected and the can went flying. "There you go," Jake said with a rare smile. "Keep practicing. In a few weeks you'll be good enough that nobody will want to mess with you." But it wasn't a few weeks before trouble arrived. It was 6 days. Mary was helping Helen hang laundry when she heard the horses. 3 riders approaching from the east, moving with purpose. Jake was out checking the far pasture with Luke, leaving only Sam on guard. Mary's heart began to race as she recognized the lead rider's slouched posture and greasy hair. Frank Sullivan had come for her. Sam stepped out from the barn, rifle in hand. "That's far enough, gentlemen. This is private property." Frank reined in his horse about 20 yards out, his two companions flanking him. They were rough-looking men, the kind who made their living doing dirty work for whoever would pay. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Frank called out, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just here to collect what's mine, my wife." Mary stepped forward before Helen could stop her, anger overriding fear. "I'm not your wife anymore, Frank, and I was never your property." Frank's face twisted into something ugly. "That's where you're wrong, Mary. We're married legal and proper, and that means you belong to me until death do us part. Now come on down here and get on my horse. We're going home." "I'm already home." "The hell you are. You're standing on stolen property with stolen goods. That cowboy had no right to buy you. That deal's void, and you're coming back with me." Sam raised his rifle a fraction higher. "She said her piece, Sullivan. Time for you to leave." One of Frank's companions, a scar-faced man with dead eyes, moved his hand toward his gun. "Maybe we don't feel like leaving." The tension ratcheted up instantly. Mary could feel it like electricity in the air, that moment before a storm breaks when everything goes still and charged. She glanced at Helen, who had quietly retrieved a shotgun from inside the cabin and now stood in the doorway, pointing it at the intruders. "You're outnumbered and outgunned," Helen said calmly, "and Jake Harrison will be back any minute with more men. If I were you, I'd ride out now while you still can." Frank's eyes darted around, calculating odds. Mary could see the wheels turning in his head, weighing his desire for revenge against the very real possibility of getting shot. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Frank spat in the dirt and jerked his reins. "This ain't over, Mary. I'll get a court order, have you dragged back by the law." "You can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding. I'm standing right here making my own choices for the first time in my life, and if you try to take that from me, I'll fight you with everything I have." Frank's laugh was bitter and harsh. "You always were too stupid to know when you were beaten. Fine, we'll do this the legal way. But don't think that Cowboy's going to protect you when the judge orders you back where you belong." He wheeled his horse and galloped off, his companions following. Mary watched them disappear into the distance, her whole body shaking with adrenaline. Sam lowered his rifle slowly, and Helen came to wrap an arm around Mary's shoulders. "You did good, standing up to him like that," Helen said quietly. "I was terrified. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing what needs doing anyway." Jake returned an hour later and listened grimly as they recounted what had happened. His expression grew darker with each detail, and by the end, his hands were clenched into fists. "I should have been here." "You can't be everywhere at once," Mary said.
"And Sam and Helen handled it. We all did."
"Frank's right about one thing, though. He'll go to the law now, try to use the courts against you. We need to make sure Patrick O'Brien is ready with our petition first. I'll ride to Clearwater tomorrow, see if we can speed things along." That night, Jake called a meeting with everyone on the ranch. Luke and Sam Peterson, Helen and Mary gathered in the cabin while Jake laid out the situation. "Things are going to get harder before they get better," he said bluntly. "Frank Sullivan's a mean snake, and he won't let this go. We need to be smart and careful. No one travels alone. We keep watches at night. And, most importantly, we stick together. Mary's under our protection now, and that means something." Luke Peterson, the older of the two brothers, spoke up. "We're with you, Jake. Frank Sullivan's the kind of man who gives all of us a bad name. Happy to help make sure he doesn't get what he wants." "Appreciate that," Jake replied. "Mary, how are you holding up?" She considered the question honestly. "I'm scared, but I'm also angry, and the anger's starting to win out over the fear. Frank controlled my life for 3 years. I won't let him control it anymore." Jake nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Fear keeps you alert, but anger gives you strength. Just make sure the anger doesn't make you careless." Over the following week, Jake made 2 trips to Clearwater, consulting with Patrick O'Brien and preparing their legal strategy. The petition for annulment was filed, citing abandonment, cruelty, and the involuntary sale of Mary by her husband. O'Brien was optimistic but cautious, warning that the outcome would depend heavily on which judge heard the case. Meanwhile, Frank made his own moves. Word came through various sources that he'd hired a lawyer and was preparing a countersuit, claiming Mary had been stolen from him and demanding her return plus damages for the loss of his property. He was painting himself as the victim, a wronged husband whose wife had been seduced away by a stranger with money. "It's ridiculous," Mary fumed when she heard this. "He sold me. In front of the whole town. How can he claim I was stolen? Because he's desperate and shameless, Helen replied. Men like Frank will say anything if they think it might work. The truth doesn't matter to them, only winning. The waiting was agonizing. Days turned into weeks with no word from the court. Mary threw herself into ranch work, finding that physical labor helped quiet her anxious mind. She learned to milk cows, tend chickens, repair fences, and a dozen other tasks. Her hands, soft from years of indoor work, developed new calluses. Her body grew stronger, and with each passing day she felt more like herself than she had in years. Jake was a constant, steady presence. He never pushed her to talk about her feelings or pressured her to be anything other than what she was. He simply worked alongside her, offering quiet companionship and occasional bits of wisdom. Mary found herself watching him sometimes, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful way he handled tools and animals, the fundamental decency that seemed baked into everything he did. She wasn't falling in love with him, she told herself firmly. That would be foolish. She'd just escaped one marriage and was fighting to end it legally. The last thing she needed was romantic complications, but she couldn't deny that she felt safe with Jake in a way she'd never felt with anyone else. He'd proven himself trustworthy in word and deed, asking nothing from her except that she stand up for herself. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake broke the comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," Mary said, curious. "What do you want once all this is over? Have you thought about it?" She had, actually, though the thoughts were still forming. "I want to be free. Really free, not just legally, but in every way. I want to make my own decisions and live with the consequences, good or bad. I want to find out who I am when I'm not trying to please someone else or avoid their anger." Jake nodded slowly. "That's a good answer. What about practically? Where will you go? What will you do?"
"I don't know yet."
"Maybe I'll stay here if you and Helen will have me. Maybe I'll move to a city and find work. Maybe I'll travel and see parts of the world I've only read about. The point is, I'll get to choose." "You're always welcome here," Jake said quietly. "For as long as you want to stay. No expectations, no obligations. Just a place to be while you figure things out." "Thank you. That means more than you know." They sat in silence again, but it was a warm silence, full of understanding. Mary felt grateful for this strange twist of fate that had brought her here, to this ranch, to these people who'd shown her what kindness looked like when it wasn't attached to conditions or threats. The summons came on a Tuesday morning. A deputy from Clearwater rode up to deliver it, looking uncomfortable with his errand. They were to appear in court in 3 days to present their case before Judge William Tucker. Frank Sullivan would be there with his lawyer, and both sides would have a chance to argue their positions. "Judge Tucker's a fair man," the deputy said quietly before leaving. "Doesn't suffer fools and doesn't like bullies." Could go either way, but at least you'll get a fair hearing. Patrick O'Brien arrived the next day to prepare them. He spent hours going over questions he might ask Mary, questions Frank's lawyer might ask, and how to present their case in the strongest possible light. "The key is credibility," he explained. "Frank will try to paint you as a wayward wife who abandoned her dutiful husband. We need to show the truth, that you're a woman who was abused, sold, and is now fighting for basic human dignity." Mary listened and tried to absorb everything, but her nerves were jangled. The idea of facing Frank in court, of having to justify her desire for freedom to strangers, felt overwhelming. But Jake and Helen were there, supporting her, reminding her why this fight mattered. The night before the hearing, Mary couldn't sleep. She paced her room, rehearsing answers to potential questions, imagining worst-case scenarios. Around midnight, she heard a soft knock on her door.
"Mary, you awake?" It was Helen's voice.
"Yes," Mary called back. Helen entered, carrying 2 cups of tea. She sat on the bed and handed one to Mary. "Couldn't sleep either. Figured you might be up. Want to talk about it? I'm terrified I'll mess this up somehow. That I'll say the wrong thing and the judge will side with Frank." "You won't mess it up. You're going to tell the truth, plain and simple. And the truth is powerful. Frank's story is built on lies and selfishness. Yours is built on survival and courage. Trust that the difference will show. What if it doesn't? What if the judge doesn't care about the truth? Then we'll figure out plan B. There's always a way forward, Mary. Always. You just have to be brave enough to keep looking for it." They sipped their tea and talked about other things, small things, until Mary's mind finally settled enough that sleep seemed possible. Helen hugged her goodnight and left, and Mary crawled into bed feeling slightly less alone with her fears. The day of the hearing dawned clear and bright, the kind of beautiful day that seemed to mock the darkness of the task ahead. They traveled to Clearwater in Jake's wagon, Mary dressed in the best dress Helen had been able to lend her, her hands twisted in her lap during the entire journey, nervous energy with nowhere to go. The courthouse was an imposing stone building in the center of town. Inside, the courtroom was all dark wood and serious faces. Frank was already there with his lawyer, a slick-looking man named Cyrus Whitmore, who had a reputation for winning cases through manipulation and legal trickery. Frank looked at Mary with open hatred, and she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear. Judge Tucker entered, a stern older man with white hair and penetrating gray eyes. Everyone rose as he took his seat behind the bench. The judge banged his gavel once, and the proceedings began. Whitmore spoke first, laying out Frank's case. He painted Frank as a victim, a hard-working man driven to desperate measures by crushing debt, who'd made a terrible mistake in selling his wife but now deeply regretted it and wanted her back. He glossed over the cruelty and abuse, reframing Frank's actions as those of a man under unbearable pressure who'd temporarily lost his way. Mary listened in disbelief as her suffering was minimized and Frank's actions were excused. She wanted to stand up and shout the truth, but Patrick O'Brien had warned her to stay calm, to wait her turn. Then it was O'Brien's turn. Court. He stood and addressed the court with quiet authority. Your Honor, this case is not about a man who made a mistake. It's about a pattern of cruelty, culminating in the ultimate betrayal. Frank Sullivan didn't accidentally sell his wife, robotically treated her as property to be auctioned to the highest bidder. And now, having pocketed the money from that sale, he wants the court to give her back so he can continue to control and abuse her. O'Brien called Mary to the stand. She swore to tell the truth and sat down, her heart hammering. O'Brien's questions were gentle but thorough, walking her through her marriage, the escalating abuse, the financial troubles Frank had brought on himself through gambling, and finally the auction. Mary spoke clearly, fighting to keep her voice steady, determined not to break down even when recounting the worst moments. Then Whitmore got his chance to cross-examine. He was aggressive, trying to trip her up, suggesting she was lying or exaggerating, implying she'd wanted to leave Frank and had used the auction as an excuse. Mary held firm, answering each question honestly, refusing to be bullied or confused. Mrs. Sullivan, isn't it true that you'd grown tired of your husband and saw Mr. Harrison as a way out of a marriage you no longer wanted? No, that's not true. I was terrified during that auction. I didn't know Jake Harrison, didn't know what he'd do to me. I didn't want any of it to happen. But you didn't return to your husband afterward. Surely if you'd truly been sold against your will, you would have sought to return to your rightful place. My rightful place? My husband sold me. He gave up any right to call me his wife when he did that. And even if he hadn't, I wouldn't go back to a man who'd hit me, belittled me, and made my life miserable for 3 years. Whitmore tried several more angles, but Mary didn't waver. When he finally sat down, looking frustrated, O'Brien called Jake to the stand. Jake testified about why he'd bought Mary, about his sister's death, about his commitment to ensuring Mary had a safe place to heal and rebuild. He was straightforward and credible, and even Whitmore's aggressive cross-examination couldn't shake his story. Helen testified next, corroborating Jake's character and describing Mary's state when she'd first arrived at the ranch. She was broken, Helen said simply, scared of her own shadow. But she's gotten stronger every day since. That's what freedom does for a person. Finally, O'Brien called Frank to the stand. This was the risky part. Frank's lawyer had advised him not to testify, but Frank's ego wouldn't allow him to stay silent. He took the stand with a cocky expression that quickly faded under O'Brien's questioning. Mr. Sullivan, you sold your wife at a public auction, correct? I was forced to by my circumstances. No one held a gun to your head and made you sell her, did they? Well, no, but... And you pocketed the $500 Mr. Harrison paid, correct? That was my money, payment for my property. Your property? You're referring to your wife as property? That's not what I meant. But that's exactly how you treated her, isn't it? As something you owned that could be sold when convenient. Frank's face reddened with anger, and he started to lose his composure, snapping at O'Brien, revealing the mean streak that lurked just beneath his surface. The judge watched this display with an increasingly disapproving expression. When all testimony was complete, both lawyers made their closing arguments. Whitmore appealed to tradition and law, arguing that marriage was sacred and couldn't be dissolved simply because a wife decided she was unhappy. O'Brien appealed to justice and humanity, arguing that no law should protect a man who'd utterly betrayed his marriage vows in the most degrading way possible. Judge Tucker called a short recess to consider his decision. Mary waited in an anteroom with Jake, Helen, and O'Brien, unable to sit still, unable to do anything but pace and pray that justice would prevail. Jake stood by the window, his usual calm showing cracks of tension. Helen held Mary's hand, offering silent support. After 45 agonizing minutes, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Tucker looked grave as he prepared to deliver his verdict. Mary's whole future hung on his next words. "I've considered the testimony and arguments carefully," the judge began. "This is not an easy case. Marriage is indeed sacred and should not be dissolved lightly. However, marriage is also a contract based on mutual respect, care, and fidelity. When one party violates that contract in such a fundamental way as to sell their spouse like chattel, they forfeit their claim to the protections marriage provides." Mary's heart leaped with hope. "Mr. Sullivan, your actions were reprehensible and demonstrate a complete disregard for your wife's dignity and humanity. You cannot sell a person and then claim that person still belongs to you. The law may have its gaps and inadequacies, but it is not so broken as to support such hypocrisy." Frank's face went white with rage and shock. "Therefore, I grant the petition for annulment. The marriage between Frank Sullivan and Mary Sullivan is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. Furthermore, Mr. Sullivan is ordered to stay at least 100 yards from Miss Mary Sullivan at all times, under penalty of arrest and imprisonment." The gavel came down with a decisive crack. Mary felt tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of relief and joy. She was free. Actually, legally, completely free. Jake's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently in congratulation. Helen was crying too, and even Patrick O'Brien looked emotional as he gathered his papers. Frank exploded from his seat, shouting obscenities and threats, until the bailiff and the judge's warning about contempt of court forced him to storm out of the courtroom. Mary watched him go and felt nothing but pity. He would never change, would never see women as anything but property, would never understand what he'd lost. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun felt different somehow, warmer and brighter. Mary stood on the steps and breathed deeply, feeling like she was tasting air for the first time. She was Mary Sullivan no more. Just Mary, belonging only to herself. "What do you want to do now?" Jake asked, smiling down at her. Mary thought about it, really thought about it. There were so many possibilities now, so many paths open to her. But right now, there was only one thing she wanted. "I want to go home," she said. "Back to the ranch. And then I want to figure out what comes next, one day at a time." "That sounds like a fine plan," Helen said, linking her arm through Mary's. They celebrated that night at the ranch with a simple dinner, but it felt like the finest feast Mary had ever attended. Luke and Sam Peterson joined them, raising glasses of whiskey and toasts to freedom and new beginnings. Jake even pulled out a fiddle Mary didn't know he owned and played a few lively tunes that had Helen dancing around the kitchen despite her age. Mary watched it all with a sense of wonder. These people, who'd been strangers just weeks ago, had become her family in the truest sense of the word. They'd fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, believed in her when she'd lost belief, and helped her find the strength to reclaim her life. As the night wore on and the celebration wound down, Mary found herself alone on the porch with Jake. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any city lights, stretching across the sky in magnificent profusion. "Thank you," Mary said quietly. "For everything. I don't think I've said that properly yet." "You don't need to thank me," Jake replied. "You did the hard work. I just gave you a chance. You gave me hope, and you asked for nothing in return. That's rare in this world." Jake was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "I lost my sister because I wasn't there when she needed help. I can't fix that, but helping you, that was something I could do. Something I needed to do, maybe. Do you think she'd be proud of you? Your sister? I hope so. I'd like to think Emma's looking down and seeing that some good came from her loss, that her story helped save someone else's." They stood in companionable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Mary felt profoundly grateful for this moment, for this place, for this man who'd seen her as human when others saw her as property. Over the following weeks, Mary settled into life at the ranch more fully. She was no longer a guest or someone in hiding, but a full member of the household. She took on more responsibilities, discovered she had a talent for training horses, and began to save the small wages Jake insisted on paying her despite her protests. Frank disappeared from their lives completely. Word filtered back that he'd left the territory, driven out by shame and the anger of townspeople who'd learned the full truth of what he'd done. Mary didn't waste energy thinking about him. He was her past, and she was focused on her future. That future began to take shape slowly. Mary realized she wanted to stay at the ranch, at least for now. She loved the work, loved the open sky and clean air, loved the sense of purpose each day brought. She also discovered she wanted to help other women in situations like hers. There had to be others out there, trapped and desperate, who needed someone to step in and offer a hand up. She shared this idea with Helen one morning while they worked in the garden. What if we made this place a refuge, a safe spot for women who need to escape bad situations? Helen looked up, interest sparking in her eyes. You mean like what Jake did for you, but on a bigger scale? We could take in 2 or 3 women at a time, give them shelter and work while they figure out their next steps, help them get legal assistance if they need it, give them a chance to heal and rebuild. Jake would go for it, Helen said thoughtfully. It's exactly the kind of thing he believes in, and Lord knows there's need for it. I've heard stories about women in terrible situations who have nowhere to turn. They brought the idea to Jake that evening. He listened thoughtfully, then nodded slowly. I like it. We need to be careful, make sure we're not putting everyone at risk by harboring too many angry husbands' attention. But if we're smart about it, keep things quiet, work through proper channels, it could work. We could call it Emma's Place, Mary suggested softly, in honor of your sister. Jake's eyes grew bright with emotion. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it was rough. She would have loved that. Thank you, Mary. They spent the next few months preparing. They expanded the cabin with an additional room, reinforced the fences, and established contacts with lawyers and lawmen in surrounding towns who could help identify women in need. Patrick O'Brien was enthusiastic about the project and offered his legal services at reduced rates for the women they helped. The first woman arrived in early fall. Her name was Ruth, and she'd walked 15 miles with a black eye and bruised ribs to escape her husband. She was terrified and suspicious, expecting a trap or some new form of exploitation. It took days before she began to trust that Emma's Place was what it claimed to be. Watching Ruth slowly relax and begin to heal, Mary felt a sense of fulfillment unlike anything she'd experienced before. This was purpose. This was meaning. Taking her own pain and using it to help others, transforming suffering into strength. By winter, they'd helped 3 women escape dangerous situations and start new lives. 2 had moved on to other territories with fresh starts and new names. Ruth stayed, becoming part of the ranch's extended family and helping with the work of caring for new arrivals. Life had a rhythm now, a pattern of work and purpose that filled Mary's days. She still had nightmares sometimes about the auction, about Frank's hands on her arm, about the feeling of being sold like livestock. But the nightmares grew less frequent as months passed, and when they came, she had people around her who understood and supported her. Jake remained a constant presence, steady and reliable. Mary's feelings for him had deepened over time, though she was careful not to let them show. She was still healing, still figuring out who she was as a free woman. Romance would complicate things, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that complication. But she couldn't help noticing the way Jake looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. There was admiration there, and warmth, and something deeper that he kept carefully contained. He never pushed, never presumed, just continued to treat her with respect and kindness that made her feel valued. One spring evening, a year after her annulment, they were riding back from checking the far pasture together. The sun was setting, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. Jake reined in his horse on a small rise overlooking the ranch, and Mary stopped beside him. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, gazing at the view. It is, Mary agreed. Then, gathering her courage, she added, Jake, can I tell you something? Always. A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never be anything but Frank Sullivan's wife, trapped and miserable until I died. And then you bid $500 and changed everything.
You changed everything,
Jake corrected gently. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and kept walking. Maybe. But I want you to know I'm grateful. Not just for saving me, but for giving me space to heal. For never expecting anything from me. For treating me like a person worth respecting. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and Mary saw everything he felt reflected in his eyes. You are worth respecting, Mary. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. And whatever you decide to do with your life, wherever you decide to go, I'll support you. What if I decided to stay here permanently? Then I'd be the happiest man in 3 territories. And what if I decided I wanted to be more than just a ranch hand or a partner in Emma's Place? What if I wanted to be more than that? Jake's breath caught. Mary, I need you to be sure about what you're asking. I don't want you to feel obligated or think you owe me anything. I don't feel obligated. I feel grateful and respected and cared for in ways I never thought possible. And somewhere along the way, I realized I'd fallen in love with you. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are. Because you're good and kind and decent, and because being with you makes me want to be the best version of myself. Jake dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't step back. Instead, he cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. I fell in love with you the moment I saw you stand up to Frank outside the courthouse, all fierce and brave and refusing to back down. I've been fighting it, telling myself you needed time and space. But if you're ready, if you're sure, then I'm all in, Mary. She kissed him then, and it was nothing like kissing Frank had been. This was warm and gentle and full of promise. This was a kiss between equals, between two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their pasts and built something new together. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. The sun had fully set, and stars were beginning to appear. They stood on that hill overlooking the ranch that had become home, holding each other and looking toward a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility. "So what happens now?" Mary asked. "Now we keep doing what we're doing. We run the ranch, we help women who need help, we build a life together, and maybe when you're ready, we make it official." Official marriage, but only if you want it. Only if you're comfortable with the idea. I know you just got out of one marriage, and the idea might not appeal. Mary considered this. The word marriage had once filled her with dread and resignation. But thinking about marrying Jake, about choosing him freely and equally, felt different. It felt right. "Ask me in 6 months. If we still feel the same way, then yes, I think I'd like that." Jake grinned. 6 months. I can work with that. They rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, close enough that their legs occasionally brushed together, talking about plans for expanding Emma's place and ideas for the coming season. Helen met them at the door with a knowing smile that suggested she'd figured out what had happened between them. "About time," was all she said, but she hugged them both with obvious delight. The next 6 months were the happiest of Mary's life. She and Jake courted properly, taking time to really know each other beyond the crisis that had brought them together. They discovered shared interests and values, learned each other's quirks and habits, and built a foundation of friendship that made their love stronger. Emma's place continued to grow. They helped 7 more women escape abusive situations. Each won a small victory against the cruelty that existed in the world. Mary became known in the region as someone who could be trusted, who would help without judgment or conditions. Women started seeking them out, and a network of support began to form. Frank Sullivan never returned. The last anyone heard, he drifted south into Mexico, chasing gold and gambling opportunities. Mary didn't care what happened to him. He was irrelevant to her life now, a bad memory that no longer had power over her present or future. When 6 months had passed, Jake asked her again, properly this time, on one knee in the garden where they'd first talked about creating Emma's place. Mary said yes without hesitation, and they married in a simple ceremony at the ranch with Helen officiating and all their friends present. It was nothing like Mary's first wedding, which had been full of false promises and forced smiles. This was real, genuine, a celebration of 2 people who'd found each other in unlikely circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful together. As they exchanged vows, Mary thought about how far she'd come, from the auction block to this moment, from property to partner, from victim to survivor to someone who helped other survivors. She'd reclaimed her life and her identity, found love and purpose, and created a family built on choice rather than obligation. The cowboy who'd bid $500 had given her a chance, but she'd done the hard work of healing, growing, and becoming the person she'd always had the potential to be. And now, standing beside Jake as his equal and partner, she knew with absolute certainty that her story wasn't about being saved. It was about saving herself, with a little help from people who believed she was worth saving. The celebration lasted long into the night. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to wish them well, to share in their joy, to be part of something that felt like more than just a wedding. It felt like hope, like proof that even in a hard world, good things could happen to good people. Later, when the guests had gone and the stars blazed overhead, Mary and Jake stood on their porch, his arm around her shoulders, looking out at the ranch that had become their shared home and mission. In the distance, a light burned in the window of Emma's place, where Ruth was helping their newest arrival settle in. "Think we made the right choice?" Jake asked softly. "I know we did," Mary replied. "This is exactly where we're supposed to be, doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing." And she meant it. Her life had taken a terrible turn that day on the auction block, but from that terrible turn had come something beautiful and meaningful. She'd found her strength, her purpose, and a love built on respect and equality rather than dominance and fear. Frank had sold her for $500, thinking he was solving a problem and making some money. What he'd actually done was set her free. The cowboy's bid had broken her chains, and she'd used that freedom to become someone who helped others break their own chains. Mary Sullivan was gone, dissolved with the annulment. In her place stood Mary Harrison, a woman who knew her worth, who fought for what was right, who loved deeply and lived fully. The past still carried pain, but it no longer defined her. She'd taken her suffering and transformed it into strength, and that strength would ripple outward, helping countless other women find their own paths to freedom. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across the ranch. Inside the cabin, Helen was humming as she cleaned up from the celebration. In Emma's place, Ruth was talking softly to the new arrival, probably sharing her own story of escape and healing. And, on the porch, two people who'd found each other in darkness stood together in the light, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. Life wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges and setbacks, difficult days and frightening moments, but they would face those challenges together, as partners and equals, building something larger than themselves. Emma's place would continue to grow, helping more women find safety and new beginnings. The ranch would prosper through hard work and cooperation, and their love would deepen with each passing year, rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. Mary leaned her head against Jake's shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible. She thought briefly of the girl she'd been, the one who'd married Frank Sullivan full of naive hope. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that real love required equality, that freedom was worth fighting for, and that the power to change your life ultimately came from within. "What are you thinking about?" Jake asked. "Everything," Mary said. "The past, the present, the future. How strange life is, how it can change in a moment. One day you're on an auction block, convinced your life is over. The next you're standing here, married to a good man, running a place that helps people, feeling more alive than you ever thought possible."
None?
Not about this, about us, about any of it. Well, except maybe that it took so long to happen. Jake kissed the top of her head. We got here when we were meant to get here, not a moment too soon or too late. Mary knew he was right. Timing was everything. If Jake had tried to help her earlier, when she was still too broken to stand up for herself, it might not have worked. If he'd come later, after Frank had sold her to someone worse, it might have been too late. But he'd come exactly when she needed him, and she'd been exactly ready enough to take the chance he offered. That was the thing about rescue, she'd learned. It only worked when the person being rescued was ready to save themselves. Jake had opened the door, but she'd walked through it. He'd offered support, but she'd done the hard work of healing. He'd believed in her, but she'd found her own strength. The night grew deeper, but they stayed on the porch, reluctant to let go of this perfect moment. Around them, the ranch settled into peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional sound of horses shifting in the barn, or the distant call of a night bird. It was the sound of home, of safety, of a life built on solid ground. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be women who needed help, ranch work that demanded attention, legal battles to support those fighting for freedom. But tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for acknowledging how far they'd come and how much they'd built together. Mary thought about all the women who would come through Emma's place in the years ahead. She hoped they would find what she'd found here, a place to heal and grow, people who believed in their worth, a chance to discover who they could become when they were free to be themselves. Each woman's story would be different, but they would all share one thing in common, the knowledge that they deserved better and the courage to reach for it. "We should probably go inside," Jake said eventually, though he made no move to actually go. "Probably," Mary agreed, also not moving. "But let's stay a little longer. I want to remember this night exactly as it is." So they stayed, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the warm breeze carry the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers, listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. It was a perfect moment, pure and simple, the kind you want to bottle up and keep forever. When they finally did go inside, Helen had left a lamp burning low on the table and retired to her own room. Mary and Jake walked through the quiet cabin to the bedroom they would now share, and Mary felt nothing but peace and contentment. This was her life now, chosen freely, built on love and respect and shared purpose. She'd been sold for $500, treated like property by a man who should have cherished her, but that sale had become the beginning of her freedom rather than the continuation of her imprisonment. The cowboy's bid had changed everything, not because he'd rescued her, but because he'd given her the chance and space to rescue herself. And she had. She'd stood up in that courtroom and fought for her freedom. She'd learned new skills and discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed. She'd transformed her pain into purpose, creating Emma's place so other women could find the help she'd found. She'd opened her heart again, carefully and cautiously, to a man who'd proven himself worthy of trust. Mary Sullivan had been sold at auction, but Mary Harrison had been born from that experience, stronger and wiser and more fully herself than ever before. The $500 bid hadn't bought her. It had freed her to become the person she was always meant to be. And as she fell asleep that night in Jake's arms, surrounded by love and safety and purpose, Mary knew with absolute certainty that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not rescue, but partnership. Not ownership, but respect. Not the end of her story, but the true beginning of her life.